the two main types of ADHD, the first one is inattentive and the other is hyperactive or impulsive.
Supporting the kid and helping them through regulating their emotions. What's usually the approach that you take?
I usually start talking about the size of feelings, firstly explaining talking about what different feelings are and the different feelings that we have in different situations, but also talking about them in terms of a size as well. So we might feel angry some days and it's a 1 out of 10. We might feel angry that's a 9 out of 10 other times.
Emotions are also just a natural part of us as humans, right? Like we want to honor our emotions, and for so long, like there's been a stigma of we need to bury those emotions, right? And we need to not honor those and not recognize them. That's not what we're saying when we're talking about emotional regulation, right?
No, that's right. They're part of life and the ups and the downs, I think. And it's definitely not about pushing them down. It's more just about having a way that we can handle our emotions so that they are not in control of us.
Hey everyone, Rupesh Patel here, host of the Two Nobodies podcast, and you just heard from Leanne Tran, who's a child psychologist from Brisbane, Australia. If you're like me and my wife and like most parents, you probably encounter your child not being able to regulate their emotions, but maybe they're just embracing them. Should they be? How do you support your kids through these moments of where they just burst out or they're having a hard time with their emotions taking over them? What about kids who are neurodivergent? It's an interesting new term talking about different brain types. Kids who are experiencing ADHD to autistic kids. How do you support these kids? This is a topic that is of an expertise for Leanne, and we get into that. It's a tricky time at school. I know my kid has just started in her first full year of school, and that's tough. How do you support kids through difficult times? How do you support those vulnerable kids like LGBTQ2+ kids or other vulnerable kids like autistic and ADHD kids? It's a sensitive time. It's a tricky time to be a parent. I get it. And this episode with Leanne will be very helpful for you. So I hope you enjoy this episode. Like and subscribe, and I look forward to all your comments. Cheers.
Welcome to the Two Nobodies podcast with my dad.
Leanne, so nice to meet you. I'm so glad that you reached out to me, and I'm glad we can make this work. I've got 2 young kids at home. I'm sure I got problems we could talk about here, and I'm sure there's lots of parents out there who could benefit from this conversation. So appreciate you making time for me. You're out in Australia, aren't you?
Yeah, yes. So it's a couple of days into our spring here, so nice and warm, which might be very different to you right now.
Well, yeah, you know what though? Edmonton is getting a heat wave right now. We're in the 30s. We're in Celsius here, so it's quite warm, unusually warm, too warm. But yeah, we will transition very quickly to that colder climate. What is the spring like in Australia? I don't know if it's different on the East Coast versus the West Coast, but is it largely a pretty good spring?
Yeah, it is. I think we have less in the way of variation between our seasons than you do. Our winter is short and fairly mild, and then spring is already in the 20s and in the first couple of days. And but it's beautiful. Where I live in Brisbane in Queensland, and there are just blue skies every day, entirely blue. It's really beautiful. So it's a lovely time of year, and it's not, meltingly hot quite yet.
Yeah. That's really great. If I'm not mistaken, I feel like Brisbane is getting the Olympics. Is that right?
Yeah. Yes, I'm not sure when in quite a few years, but there's lots of discussion and talk about it at the moment and planning and that kind of thing.
Yeah, that's exciting. You're a child psychologist, which is why, like, when you reached out to me, I was really excited about that. How long have you been doing that profession?
Yeah, I've been doing it for close, probably close on 20 years, actually.
Okay.
It's amazing how quickly it goes by.
Yeah.
I feel like I'm still only 20 something. So to talk about 2 decades worth of work is a lot.
Yeah.
Yeah, but I really love it. Right from when I started, I think kids are just so much fun to be
Mm,
around, that it's a lot of fun day to day in my job. And I feel like uh, there's an opportunity to make a big difference with
yeah.
starting out with clients who are so young and helping parents through that process. So, yeah, I've enjoyed it the whole time.
Have you always been focused on little people?
I think so. I mean, in my
Yeah.
career, I first started out with working with adults,
Mm,
and I think as a new graduate, I went out and my first position was working in prisons to deliver
okay.
drug rehab programs. Yeah,
Okay.
so it was quite naive of me, I think, at the time to think, yeah, that will be no problem.
Mm,
Um, and I think doing that, I just had this real sense that for lots and lots of people, they needed help so much earlier. And
mhm.
so then I was looking for a different position and found one working with young children and never looked back from that.
Yeah. Do you find that when parents bring their children, do they still feel a bit of a stigma of coming to a psychologist and bringing their children? Like I feel like it's getting less and less for adults, anyways, to go seek counseling. But I wonder
Mm.
for kids, is there still this feeling from a parent to be like, I should be able to handle this, or I should be able to support my own kid, and or what are you seeing? I guess with the clients that come to you.
Yeah, I think there is. I work mostly with children who are in, I guess, developing differently. So
Mm,
I work in educational and developmental psychology. So rather than mental health, it's a lot more about how kids are growing and developing, whether it's along a typical pathway or a neurodivergent pathway. I still do see kids for mental health challenges, but it's not the acute kind of really serious um, things that you might imagine.
mhm.
But I think there is still stigma about seeing a child psychologist. I think it's twofold as well because
Mm,
it's parents feel potentially, unsure about what's going on for their child and maybe a bit embarrassed or a bit shameful sometimes about what their child's doing, but they also
mhm.
feel that about their parenting as well
Okay.
because the two kind of go hand in hand together. So, yeah, I've talked to parents lately who have been recommending. Um, well, it sounds funny to bring it up, but it's a situation where they were recommending me to a family of theirs that they know, or sorry,
Mm,
family friend, and having that conversation about the stigma, saying
mm,
there's no harm in seeking some advice and help and information. It might be okay, but you know, yeah, I guess you don't know until you go.
yeah.
But from my point of view, I think it's a very normal conversation to be having, and it's usually about, what's going on in your life with your children and your family. What are the challenges and sticking
Mhm.
points that you'd like to try and address? And it's about thinking about what if you could change something to make your family life run smoother and for people to
Right.
be happier, what would it be? So for me, that's a very natural, normal thing to talk about. Um, yeah.
Yeah. And how much of it would you say is supporting the child directly versus really helping the parent and them having to do the work in these sessions, I guess. Is it supporting both the parents and the children? I guess maybe it's a case by case thing, but are you essentially a therapist for both the parent and the child, or is it strictly focused on the child? Like, what does that look like?
I think it varies, you're right, depending on what a couple of things. One is how old the child is, and then
Mm,
also what the issues and difficulties are. But it's always a balance of, well, I was going to say it's almost always a balance of both. It's usually a balance of both, but
mm-hmm,
sometimes it might be working with just parents.
mm,
Um, it's never working just with the child. I think even when I see teenagers about their mental health and they're kind of day-to-day functioning and skills. I'm still trying to tell the parents what we're working on so that they can support their kids at home. And it's because children are different from adults because they are dependent on the system around them.
Mm-hmm.
They need it to survive. So sometimes changing a child that then goes back into a system that might be maybe maintaining some behaviors by how parents respond is going to not be very effective.
So I guess there definitely has to be work that's done by the parents at their home, like you said, in order for the the counseling or the therapy that you're supporting that child with to be effective.
Yeah. And that's not to say that parents are doing it wrong, which is sometimes what they might think, but it's just
Mm,
that they don't know the strategies that are going to help a child with ADHD or
mm-hmm.
anxiety or an autistic child. And so it's just about providing information that can help parents, first of all, see their child a little bit differently,
Mm-hmm.
because I think the more empathic we are, the more patient we are. And so understanding your child and how they function helps you be empathic. But
Yeah.
then the second thing is just knowing the particular strategies and skills that work for kids with that kind of development.
Mm-hmm.
Um, it's not necessarily that parents are doing anything wrong. It's just that they don't know exactly what to do yet.
Yeah, yeah. Do you find that parents come in with a sense of shame or guilt, or or with the kind of folks that you're supporting, are they already there, or are they already fairly open to things?
Usually, parents are fairly open. I think
Yeah.
it depends what stage they're at with their kids as well.
Mm-hmm.
But I think what I find as a theme is that fundamentally parents do want to know how to support their kids in the best way.
Mm,
So wherever they are in their journey about how they feel about their kids or their parenting or what's going on, it usually we usually all come back to the point of, but what's going to help your child in the next couple of months or years, and
sure.
that's the thing we focus on.
Yeah. Yeah. Uh, I know you do a lot of, I believe you do a lot of work with supporting parents and kids as they're going through school. Certainly here right now in Canada, kids are returning back to school. My 6.5-year old is starting grade one. I don't know. It's interesting to see just the change from kindergarten to grade one, but it's like you're
Hmm.
already starting to see that level of a little bit more independence, a little bit of like, yeah, hey, I got this, or I don't need to necessarily bring you into everything. I had a fun little conversation. I told my daughter, I was like, I feel like I don't know if you're gonna hold my hand anymore. She's like, "Oh, daddy, I'll still
Yeah.
hold your hand." And that was just my own
Right.
little reaffirmation that, but
Yep.
it's interesting to see to watch them. But I find myself, and I don't know if other parents feel the same way, that you're constantly thinking about how do you best support your kid, but maybe they just got it, and so do you just let them be, because you don't want to, they need to get through these things, you don't need to hover or helicopter, but you just
Yeah.
don't sometimes know when the timing of when to support, when to insert yourself, because um they also seem to show that they've got it, but maybe they don't. Like it's such a
Mm.
confusing time of not knowing whether they need that support or not sometimes.
Yeah, I think you've summed that up so well. And the challenge is that as our kids grow and develop new skills, that line of where to support and where to let them go for it on their own shifts as well.
Hmm.
As they learn new things, then they start off with not being able to do it by themselves, and then they gradually get there, and then the next stage comes along and the next one. So yeah, you've got a few more to go if your oldest is 6.5.
Yeah, yeah.
um, but I think I read this great book recently by Alison Gopnik, and it's called The Scientist. No, it's not. Sorry, it's called The Gardener and the Carpenter, and she
Hmm.
talks about how rather than treat parenting as a carpentry job where we're trying to mold and fashion and build something, treat it more like a gardening role where whatever is planted will grow and it's your job to
Mm.
just tend to it. and provide what it needs. And I think that was, for me, a really great reframe of thinking that, most of the time kids are going to be okay and they're going to develop the skills that they need. Sometimes they might need a little bit more help here and there in different areas, but they will mostly get there on their own if you kind of try and let them be who they are and love them for who they are and build a relationship with who they are.
Yeah, that that reminds me of a couple of things. One is I had a guest on the show who used to actually be Nelson Mandela's bodyguard. He used to protect
Mm,
Nelson Mandela, and Nelson Mandela used to tell him that the way he approaches leadership is he loved to garden, and it
right.
was about essentially creating that environment or those conditions for people to succeed and not over nurturing but also not
Hmm.
under nurturing. And but sometimes it's like um I think the tricky part that I find is you don't always know exactly when to give that plant some water or when to provide those nutrients, right? And especially when you know it's your child and your heart is out, you're essentially your heart's outside your chest. It's
Yeah.
becomes even more you question yourself a little bit, right? But my dad also, I mean, he used to be he's passed now, but he used to be very philosophical, and gardening was also his passion. And I remember he used to tell me that the way he approached parenting was largely through gardening and giving
Mm,
me the opportunity to just grow. And he would step in at those times where he felt like he needed to nurture a little bit, right? But I always wonder, sort of, how did he figure that out, right? And we probably all do, but it's just a question that goes through my head constantly. So.
yeah. And there is, I mean, why I can relate to that too. We have just out the window here, I can see it. There's a passion fruit vine that grows between my house and the neighbor. That's a
That's
wild
amazing,
one.
by the way. That's
Really?
amazing. Yeah, I think so, that you have a passion fruit vine. That's pretty
And
awesome.
it's wild as well. No one, well, it's probably not, but nobody knows who planted it. It's anyway. But
Yeah.
it twists around along the fence and you can see the tendrils kind of coming out and finding a way, and they wrap around the fence to kind
Mhm.
of continue on. And that's why I love gardening as well, to see those, that kind of natural growth is really awe-inspiring, I think.
Mhm.
But luckily for us as humans, I think one of the pieces of research I think is really reassuring to parents is that when you're thinking about raising a child who is resilient, that you have a really healthy attachment and relationship to, that's developed by responding to a child's needs with what they actually need at the
Mhm.
time. So kind of when they're asking for something, if we respond, and the research shows when if we get it right 30% of the time, they're going to be well attached to us and have a good relationship with us. So
Mm.
I noticed from your facial expression, it seems low, right?
Yeah, very low.
Yeah. So I think that's when we worry about, are we, how do you know, are we getting it right or are we getting it wrong? Probably we're doing it 30% of the time. So,
Because there's
it's
I
going to
think
be okay.
there's this fear that if you, I mean, I don't expect to get it right all the time, but you
Mm,
also, like, I don't know, I hope that, especially with some of these tougher things that kids have to deal with, that I hope that my children come to myself and my wife first rather than going to their friends. I imagine a lot of parents probably share a similar feeling. And so you think that, okay, if you're wrong 70% of the time, that just leaves a much wider door open for other influencers to kind of come and
mm,
potentially, maybe not provide the best information to your kid, right? Because it's like maybe
yeah.
your kid doesn't trust you with getting it right. So that's interesting that only 30%.
Yeah, it is. But I think you're right about that, wanting your kids to come to you as well. And I think that's important to try and keep a track of over the years as well, because when kids start out, they need us for everything. But
Hmm.
that changes over time. And what becomes more important is the relationship they have with us through their tween years and then teenage years.
Yeah.
And I think it's that foundational relationship is the thing that makes them come back to us rather than ask their friends or their peers or somebody else for help.
Yeah.
Um, yeah. So and I think that the relationship and that attachment's probably the key piece that underlies everything throughout parenting and raising a child, discipline and everything else. It's
Mm-hmm.
that relationship with us is what makes them listen, basically.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And how much of that is, in terms of the weight of that focus and that attachment? I mean, like you said, naturally, obviously, younger kids need more attention. They need more focus, but there seems to be a very strong emphasis on the early years. But I guess I would imagine that support and that presence is still required, like throughout a child's life, right? Like it can't just be it might just show up differently, but I imagine
Yeah.
that presence and that attachment should still be there, right? Like it seems like there's a strong focus on those early years, but I imagine it should be consistently across the board.
Yeah, that's right. I think it's foundational in those early years, I guess, because they depend on us
Yeah.
so much for everything. And it's why it's sorry, that's the time when they're learning a lot of skills like
Mhm.
regulating themselves and their emotions, which comes as something you do together right in the
Yeah.
beginning, right from when you're picking up this crying baby and you're kind of
Mm.
reassuring it. You're probably doing a lot of that with a 10-month-old right now. Um, and those that builds that really strong foundation, but it does continue. There's that we run a group program in my practice called the Circle of Security. Don't know if
Okay.
you've heard of
No,
it.
I've never
No,
heard of that,
it's
no.
it's about attachment, and it teaches, I guess, how you kind of form that relationship and
Mhm.
balance, I guess, the need between letting your kids go out and explore and try things for themselves. And then when they come back to you for reassurance, that's when you provide that safety and reassurance. And it's this little circle that kids follow. And you can see it physically when little kids play. They'll go out and explore and then they'll come back for a cuddle. And the way I see it is that that continues on throughout childhood, but the circle just gets a lot bigger and it looks
Mhm.
differently. And so at the moment, I have teenage boys, and I can see that they will. So, it's not so much physical that they leave and they come back for a cuddle. It's maybe that they will have a couple of days where they're not really that friendly. And then they'll come back and they'll be like, "Hey, mum, what's up?" And
Yeah,
I'll
yeah.
say, that's the moment I drop everything and go, "Yeah, not much. What do you want to do?"
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
um, and yeah, so it's still, you're right, it's still important, and you need to keep it up throughout those primary school years and middle school and then into high school as well.
Yeah, and I imagine for like in your case with your boys, like that sense of stability for them to know that okay, yeah, I don't need to talk to mom all that much for a couple of days, but like I know she'll be there when I need to talk to her. Like that's probably the most important thing, right?
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. Um, with supporting kids through school, the other thing that comes to mind is uh, kids with certain vulnerabilities.
Mm.
When you think about whether it be the LGBTQ 2+ population or other kids with that, with certain needs, I think it's I imagine it's really tough for some parents in supporting their kids through school. What's your focus? What do you see with the clients coming to you? Like, what are the kind of, I guess, what are the type of clients coming to you in terms of when they need support from school, and how do you approach those situations from a psychologist perspective? I guess.
Mm. Yeah, it's a good question. I think there's so many parts to it as well. And so for parents, I guess one of the things is, first of all, trying to have that relationship with your kids, as
Mm,
that's a really big protective thing. If they've got that with you, they'll feel um, a lot more secure and resilient. If it's gone off track, you can always try and get it back on track, which is
mm,
um, really important as well. But I think parents, what they can do is be around a lot for their kids, teenagers particularly, and even, I guess, tweens and middle schoolers, they will talk to you when you're around. If you're
Mm-hmm.
not around and then on the weekend want to chat with them, they don't naturally open up. But it's when you're around and they have those incidental moments of telling you about their day or what's on their mind that can really help. Um, when I guess I do tend to get involved in that when kids have difficulty in school. Sometimes it's if they are experiencing bullying at school or just general difficulties fitting in with a peer group. And that's
Mm-hmm.
probably in my practice and in Australia, what I see more commonly than bullying is just that difficulty trying to find the right group and their tribe of people. Um, And I guess as a psychologist, that what happens sometimes is that things follow this pattern, which isn't a great pattern. And it's where kids have difficulty at school, either with peers or, being bullied. They generally then it tends to affect their schoolwork and things like
Mm-hmm.
that, or they might develop some mental health difficulties like anxiety or depression. um, I really want to make sure that we're getting involved right then, because as it goes along, then the worst thing is this, like, not attending school, whether it's school
Mm-hmm.
refusal or disengagement, and that's really hard to get kids back from, I think, and that
Mm-hmm.
changes the course of um, the path their life follows pretty significantly.
Yeah.
So it's often about working with the school about how they can try to support the child there. Um, Whether it's helping with social issues, helping with school, helping manage moods, and even, you know things in the classroom, like being able to offer the kids a break when they need a break, or maybe
Mm.
reducing the workload. And little things can make a big difference throughout their day. And if it helps kids be at school and be happier at school, then that's a big win.
Yeah. When when you see, especially dealing with kids and bullying, I can admit to being bullied when I was very young, and it took me a while to yeah, I mean, I don't know if you quite overcome that, but it certainly affects the way you approach relationships when you're an adult. And
Hmm.
then when you experience that as an adult too, it's very triggering, and it can, if you haven't done the work, it brings back a lot of those things. And it's also a really confusing time, especially when you get bullied as an adult. You're like, how is this? How is this still happening?
Yeah.
But do you see that when bullying isn't addressed early, like what the sort of, I guess, how that trauma kind of carries forward?
Yeah, I think, and that's true for a whole range of kids, and the kids I work with autistic kids, probably more so in terms of the bullying, but sometimes
Mhm,
kids with ADHD, I think it is experienced like many little traumas over and over throughout
mhm,
your childhood, is really adds up and it does snowball. Um, and almost ends up with a result similar to PTSD.
mhm,
And I know the research on that is changing a little bit to make us think that it's not just a reaction to one big thing. It's more likely there's small little traumas continually throughout childhood, and it kind of goes back to that attachment as well with parents to begin with. But yeah, those I think the trickiest thing with child psychology is that if those things add up and occur one after the other, then
right,
to try to unpack it means then you're peeling back layers upon layers at a time. And that's, maybe like you experience in adulthood, that's why it's really difficult to
yeah,
address things, because
yeah,
it's not just one thing anymore, it's one thing on many things.
right,
So you might have a child that, has been bullied. That's awful. But then maybe they don't sleep well, and then they don't
mm,
do well at school, and then they have other problems. So it
and it
becomes
compounds,
really,
right?
yeah, yeah,
Yeah,
becomes
yeah,
really complicated.
yeah. Uh, do you are you I don't know if you have any thoughts or evidence of this, but are you noticing that kids of today or the school community is just a lot more aware and supportive of the kids that you're speaking about, like whether it be autistic kids or kids experiencing ADHD? Is the world just different in terms of acceptance and understanding and awareness and support for these type of kids, or there's always work to do? But like, have you seen that things are improving and things are getting better, or are we still kind of failing these kids?
I think a lot is changing and a lot is improving. There is still work to do, like you mentioned, but it's getting a lot better. I think I think people are getting a lot better. When I say people, I mean, I guess, communities and schools better at supporting or being accepting of difference and accommodating for some of those differences is probably the next step to go. So people are a lot more accepting of autistic kids or kids with ADHD, but then to kind of, in Australia anyway, are still expecting them to fit into that one size fits all school mold, which is
Hmm.
just not the case for everybody. Yeah.
Yeah.
I wonder if the same is true for, LGBTQ2 plus or also
Mm.
transgender kids as
Hmm.
well,
Hmm.
because I think there's a little bit more acceptance about things, but making the accommodations, like things like potentially with school uniforms and giving kids a choice and
Right.
that kind of thing, is a bit behind. But I don't think you have school uniforms in Canada, do you?
Well, you might. I mean, you might. Catholic schools will sometimes have
Right,
uniforms, and those will be public. Otherwise, private would. But yeah, so it does exist, but not necessarily in the public school system.
right.
Purely the public school system.
Mm,
Um, I know that when you, as part of when you reached out to me, you said that you work with neurodivergent kids, and the
mm.
term neurodivergency or neurodivergent was fairly new to me. So maybe I
Yeah,
don't know, it could be new to others as well. Do you mind just kind of speaking to really what that means?
yeah, sure. It is a new concept, I guess, and it's become very popular to talk about, and as part of clinical practice in Australia of late as well. Um, and we've recently had psychology guidelines change to talk about it being one of the key competencies of psychologists is to be able to provide care that's neuroaffirming. And so, what it really means is that, I guess, I also, forgive me, listeners, because I break things down the way I do with kids. So it may be very simple for you, but um, neuro refers to brain, and divergent refers to different types or being different. So
Mm,
we would see that kids developing along a typical path. Typical means, as expected. So neurotypical means their brains are as we'd expect. And that's kind of because that's, I guess, what in the main is most common. And neurodivergent means different brain types. So, for example, ADHD is a brain type,
mhm,
and autism is a brain type. We're moving away from seeing things as disorders now and trying to present it as a difference um,
mhm,
that is recognized, and potentially still we talk about disability. So it's
mhm.
something that's not affects how someone can function day to day, but it
Right.
takes out that word disorder, which makes it sound like there's something wrong with somebody for being autistic.
That makes a lot of sense. And I mean, if you think about like other parts of the body, if there are differences between people, we just treat them as differences, right? We don't
Hmm.
necessarily call these things disorders, but when it comes to the brain, for some reason, it- that's an interesting, like we've approached it differently. So yeah, that term enables that acceptance of differences for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah. Uh, yeah, that's very interesting. Okay, so in terms of supporting, I guess, neurodivergent kids, then, so in terms of different brain types, like you talked about ADHD, autistic kids,
Hmm.
what are some other, I guess, types of neurodivergent pathways or brain types?
Those are the ones that are most common to me. I
Okay.
think also learning disorders is another um, is another brain type. So that might be an old term was dyslexia, but where kids have learning disorders in
Mm,
reading or writing or math. Sometimes people break down, or sometimes people talk about mental health in that way
mm,
as well. So potentially, um, probably, I haven't heard it so much in terms of anxiety, but maybe more things like OCD or so obsessive compulsive disorder
mm.
or those kind of things. Yeah,
And
sometimes. Sorry, go on.
no, go ahead, please.
Oh, I was just going to say sometimes people talk about it in terms of, I guess, some of those more serious mental health difficulties like personality disorders or that kind of thing.
Hmm. Yeah.
Oh, actually, sorry, I didn't mean that. I meant like bipolar. So,
Okay.
yeah.
Yeah. Do you know, I imagine there must be, but in terms of the actual like neural networks and um the way then the central nervous system is for folks who have autism versus folks who have ADHD, does it are there parts that are actually built differently, or is it just yeah, do we know that, or is there sorry, I feel like it's a bit of a naive question, or I don't
No,
know.
no, I don't think it is at all. I think it's a complicated question because
Mm,
it's you were asking about is are there differences? I know that I don't know. So for ADHD, there are some structural differences,
mhm,
but autism, I don't think so. But I could be wrong. But
mm,
there are definitely differences in terms of the functioning, so how the brain
mhm.
works. Yeah.
Yeah,
So
yeah,
in ADHD, it's a lot about the regulation, which is different. So the ability to regulate all things. Attention is one of them, but
yeah,
also emotions and behavior and thinking are all affected. So that's usually behind what other kids of the same age might be able to do.
yeah, yeah,
And similar kind of in terms of autism as well. So differences in how people are processing sensory information and language and that kind of thing.
yeah, yeah. Can we just maybe have a definition for ADHD? Like, I feel like there could be misconceptions about what really ADHD could be, or perhaps maybe there's different types of it. I don't know, but are you able to kind of define it for people? Or
Yeah, sure. There are different types. And so it stands for attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. Um, and the two main types of ADHD, the first one is inattentive and the other is hyperactive or
mm,
impulsive. So with inattentive ADHD, it's usually difficulty with maintaining focus uh, on something on one stimulus at a time,
mm-hmm,
basically,
mm-hmm,
which is why kids will have trouble listening to a teacher, but they'll be able to play a video game because that's many stimulus coming and going, so they can handle that better.
mm-hmm,
But so it's basically, I would describe it as a difficulty with being able to um, filter your attention. So, for example, rather than right now, you and I are probably filtering out some things. So I can, for example, I heard my dog bark before, but I can kind of hear that and rule it
mm-hmm.
out and come back to you. Whereas kids with inattention would be focusing on all of those pieces of information coming into them.
Mm-hmm.
That makes it really difficult to learn at school. It sometimes have conversations with people as well. So it can lead to disorganization and difficulty getting tasks done. So it can affect academics and also friendships. With the hyperactive impulsive type, it's usually more trouble with regulating behavior. So impulsivity means doing anything that comes to mind before you've had a chance to think through whether it's a good
Mm.
idea or not.
Right, right.
So calling out in class or getting out of your seat, things like that. And hyperactivity means just a much bigger or much higher level of movement and activity than other people. So
Yeah.
sometimes kids are described like they're kind of driven by a motor, like they actually have their an inability to stop or to slow down.
Yeah. Yeah. Do you think people use the term, like, is there, thank you for defining that, by the way, but I wonder if, because we all sometimes lose focus. We could be focusing on something, we lose focus, or you see that in kids. I imagine it's hard for parents to recognize whether there's actually something there, or whether
Mm,
this is, like, how do you help parents determine that? And the other thing I was going to say, Leanne, is I don't know if you want to, because I notice the sun is hitting your face,
it
so
is,
if you feel like you
yeah.
need to make any adjustments, feel free to do so. But
Okay.
yeah, in terms of, like, how do you help parents identify whether their child does have ADHD or not? Otherwise, because I mean, kids' minds are naturally exploring different things, and they're
Yeah.
sponges, and they're going to be exposed to different stimuli. It's natural, probably, for them to react to those things. So it's hard for parents to figure that out.
Yeah, it is. I should say too, while you were talking, I realized there's actually also a combined type of ADHD, so where kids have
Okay.
both of those things.
Okay.
Um, so that's an important piece to not leave out for parents who this is new to. It is really hard, but I think sometimes, in our language, sometimes it becomes common to just kind of talk about difficulties as though we all might have it. Like, I'm sure you've heard the phrase, like, oh, it's because, I've got OCD or things like
Yeah,
that, where
exactly.
when
Yeah.
we're neat. Um,
Right.
I think that it's what I look for in kids is if those challenges are more than their peers have. That's not always easy for parents to know either, but psychologists can help, and pediatricians can help you work that out. Because what we'll usually do is look for the behaviors that are happening and then compare that to what's typical for that age group.
Hmm.
But I think the big part for me is that when the challenges are affecting somebody's ability to function or do those kind of day to day
Hmm.
tasks. And I think if things aren't affecting your functioning, like you could be a bit impulsive or hyperactive, maybe like a real go-getter or really fun and engaging. That it's almost like personality at that point. But when it starts to get to the point it's affecting you being able to do what what you want to do day to day or functioning. So like going to school and making friends and keeping friends, then that's a good I think, guide for when it might be something that's outside the typical and you might need some extra help for it.
Hmm. Yeah. Do we know what causes ADHD? Is this kind of, is this inherited? Are there environmental influences to causing ADHD? Or yeah, what does that look like?
Yeah, we do know it's very, very genetic. And so there's probably a tiny part that could be caused by things like an injury to the brain or something. Potentially some parts could be environmental. But chances are, if the environment changes, then those symptoms will also improve. But
Hmm.
it's over 95% of the cause is genetic.
Okay.
So, yeah, if a child, it's actually, I mean, yeah, I was going to say, if a child has ADHD, chances are one of their parents will, and potentially one of their siblings as well. So in my
Okay.
practice, it's very common for kids at the moment to be identified as having ADHD, and then parents thinking, hey, hang on, I was just like that at school.
Mm.
And they go through the process and discover that they have ADHD as well.
Yeah. Can certain environmental factors exacerbate the symptoms of ADHD in any way? Like, whether it be nutrition, whether it be, I don't know, lack of sleep,
Mm.
or I don't know, even things like screen time, or I don't know, things like that.
Yeah, probably not. screen time as much, but definitely things like sleep and some nutrition. I think particularly iron, which is interesting that when kids are low in iron, sometimes they have more challenging behaviors and irritability. Um, and sometimes things like trauma, and when I'm talking about that, it's things like abuse or neglect, can
Mm.
cause difficulties in regulation that really closely mimic ADHD.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay.
Mm.
There's something else I was going to ask you about. Yeah, I guess on the topic of emotional regulation, uh, that one, I also wonder about that in terms of how that is shaped in a child. But I guess naturally for kids who have ADHD, is their ability to regulate their emotions typically, is that already, is not the right set of words, but is it off already to begin with, or is that something that kind of develops over time?
I think I would say that it's generally part of ADHD, and but it's not. It's more like it takes longer for those skills to develop. So
Mm,
uh, they kids can be. I guess the way to explain it is that they might have some delays in that area. Um, so emotional regulation is really the ability to be able to moderate or change our emotions, handle them. So when there are big emotions like anger, frustration, that kind of thing, to be able
mhm,
to do whatever we need to do to have those feelings then kind of come down to a manageable level again.
right.
And so when kids have delays with that or difficulties, if it's related to ADHD or other things, because lots of kids come for support with managing emotions, it can look like having really big reactions to smaller kind of stimulus or situations, or maybe reactions that then stay heightened for a really long time, and kids have trouble getting back down to a calm place. Or maybe they're just triggered off a lot, like lots throughout the day. They're becoming really upset. So um, yeah, it's a little bit, it's complex. It's difficult, but that's where a really big role for parents comes in, I think, because when kids are small, they have these big reactions where usually they're doing things naturally that helps them handle the emotions, like maybe you talk to your kids about it, and you name the feelings for them, and tell
Mhm,
them what's happening, and you tell them they'll be okay. You offer comfort, whether it's closeness or a cuddle or just a sympathetic look. And so all of those things are where we're co-regulating. So we're kind of helping our kids um, regulate their emotions, because they're not yet independent in doing it. And that's how they practice and learn and then eventually become independent in that. And the same's true for ADHD kids. It will just take a little bit longer potentially.
mm. Yeah, I definitely, we noticed that with our oldest, like, she's pretty good at naming her feelings, but definitely there are moments where you kind of wonder why she might be reacting the way she is. And then sometimes you try to use those tactics that you just talked about, right? Like just try to be as empathetic as possible, try to sit with her in those feelings. um and then sometimes she'll calm down, and sometimes she won't, and it can be challenging. I sometimes wonder, like, the inconsistency, like, often, like, my daughter won't necessarily just yell out in a grocery store or in the middle, but sometimes it just happens and you're just caught off in guard entirely,
Hmm.
and it's really hard to deal with those kind of situations. And you can't ignore your child because that shows that you're not responding to their needs. But at
Mm.
the same time, like, you're feeling this sense of pressure, maybe on yourself to react to that. um yeah, I don't know, sometimes it can be tough to support your kid through regulating their emotions, I guess.
Yeah, it can be for sure. I thought two things when you were talking there, and one, as you're describing kind of your daughter sometimes calming and sometimes not. I feel like my husband would say the same about me. So sometimes as adults, we have to kind of know too that kids won't be perfect at it, and
Yeah.
that it's because we're not either. We're all humans
No.
at the end of the
Yeah.
day, and some days it's harder because it's just a bad day or it's a hard day for whatever reason. Maybe you've had not as much sleep as usual, and something didn't go right with your friends, and so that means it's going to be a harder day in general to do that. But yeah, the other thing that I don't know if you ever saw it, I saw this photo that even went as viral as reaching us over here in Australia, of that American actor and director Justin Baldoni standing
Okay.
with one of his kids was having a tantrum at his feet in a shopping center or something, and he was just standing there calmly talking to his father in the moment, because he was talking about that ability to know that it's not a reflection of him as a parent, and that
Mm.
a child was going through something. He was just going to wait it out. And I just, it's so different to the experience I have, which is just
Sure.
sheer stress and panic in those times of thinking
Yeah.
everyone's looking at me and
Yeah.
judging me. And yeah, it is
And you'll still
incredibly
see
difficult.
you'll still see it from different generations. Like I find that with parents of today, when if your kid is kind of having a bit of an outburst, they kind of get it, and there's a little
Hmm.
bit more of like, let's just give them their space. They're good. They'll handle it. And
Yeah.
then sometimes you still see those older generations be like, you got to go take care of your kid. What are you doing there, right? So,
Yeah. Yep.
um, so there's still some of that.
Mm.
Yeah. One of the things I find is helpful with my daughter when if we especially if we're trying to understand sort of how her day has went. One of the strategies that we've have found it being effective is to not ask her right after school how her day went,
Yeah. Hmm.
because we noticed that she could be just processing how the day went. She could be full of emotions. If something had just happened too, she's not really ready to talk about it. And that is true for adults too. I don't know about you, but like when I come home from work, yeah, I'm in dad mode, but at the same time, I kind of don't really want to talk about my day. I kind of just want to settle in and at least need it like 5 or 10 minutes, right?
Yeah.
To settle in, and then I'm kind of maybe more ready to talk about things. So I imagine the same thing is true for kids. And then we find with like later on, hour or two, you'd start talking about her day, and she naturally just opens up a little bit more.
Yeah. I think so, because I always, I think drawing the analogy to how you feel after work is a good one, because school and learning and play really is a child's occupation, and so they've been doing a lot of stuff, processing a lot of stuff, learning a lot of stuff, and sometimes they just need that time to transition from doing that into being at home and playing, and yeah, processing everything that's happened. They're probably tired, they might be hungry.
Yeah.
um, yeah.
As a psychologist, when patients come to you or clients come to you about how to support their kids through emotional regulation, you kind of talked about some of that. But in terms of supporting the kid and helping them through, uh, regulating their emotions, what's usually the approach that you take?
I usually start out talking about the size of feelings, firstly explaining what, or talking about what different feelings are, and the
Mm,
different feelings that we have in different situations, but also talking about them in terms of a size as well. So we might feel angry some days and it's a 1 out of 10. We might feel angry that's a 9 out of 10 other times. And so talking about how, um, I usually talk about how big things are hard to hold. I
mm,
sometimes do it practically with giving kids, a couple of fit balls and asking them if they can help me carry them down to my office. And they're like, no, it's too big to hold. And like, oh, so that's like the really big feelings. It's too hard to hold. But if
mm.
you make it smaller, then it's easier to handle and to carry. And so that's where then the
I like that.
strategies come in. Yeah, I think kids are really concrete and
Yeah.
practical and visual. And so then the I guess they need to understand the concept of why would I calm down? And then once they do, you can teach them some of the strategies about how. So common ones are things like deep breathing, sometimes some which I will teach kids, I guess, in a few different ways. There are some lots of fun videos on YouTube about different kind of slow breathing for kids. Maybe like breathing in like you're smelling a flower and breathing out like you're trying to make a candle flicker but not blow out.
Mm-hmm.
Or we do a lot of blowing bubbles as well because you have to do that really slow breath in, but then a long breath out with that kind of particular shaped mouth when you're trying to blow bubbles or through a straw really helps them
Right.
get the concept of it. Um, that's for young kids, I guess. And then when you're talking about it with older kids too, sometimes you bring in how thinking plays a part as well, because some
Mm-hmm.
days where our emotions are different depending on the situation, and or in the same situation you have a different feeling to the person next to you. And why is that? It's because it's how you're thinking about it. So trying to shift some of those maybe patterns of thinking kids have or beliefs that they have that contributes to why they're getting so upset about things.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, those are great. Those are, thank you for sharing those. As you were talking, one of the things that was coming to mind is we've been talking a lot about emotional regulation, but and maybe you can kind of differentiate this a little bit, because emotions are also just a natural part of us as humans, right? Like we want to
Yeah.
honor our emotions, and for so long, like there's been a stigma of we need to bury those emotions, right? And we
Hmm.
need to not honor those and not recognize them. That's not what we're saying when we're talking about emotional regulation, right?
No, that's right. Yeah. I think one of the questions you had sent through was really great because you when we were chatting about this discussion, should we be embracing our emotions? And yeah, we definitely should. They're part of life and the ups and the downs, I think. And it's definitely not about pushing them down. It's more just about being having a way that we can handle our emotions so that they are not in control of us. We're kind of I wouldn't say we're in control of our emotions, but yeah, you don't want to kind of have them be guiding everything you do. So every choice that you're making is coming from a really emotional place, because that's yeah, it's not a nice place to live to be like that. So it's just about. Sorry, what was your question?
No, I was just gonna say, so I could understand that with emotions that maybe we generally categorize as perhaps more negative, but if they're positive emotions, why wouldn't
Mm.
we want to be consumed by them? Why would we want to regulate those?
Yeah, well, I guess mostly you could. You could. Um, Sometimes for the kids I work with who, like particularly ADHD kids, if they're happy and excited, or even autistic kids as well, that can be it can be really difficult to handle. And
Hmm.
I think most of the time it's just about being potentially choosing where we let them go, and where we don't. So if you're really excited in class, you kind of have to be able to maybe handle it a little bit so that you're not bouncing out of your seat and running around in the
Hmm.
classroom. But
Hmm.
it's fine at home to do that. So yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, I know I'm kind of struggling with this one. I know what we're trying to say, but I feel like it's not like I can kind of see the distinction, but we're not trying to say don't embrace your emotions, but yet there's a kind of a time and place, or it could be, or by not having some sort of regulation, it may not allow you to achieve the outcome that you're maybe hoping to have, or something of
Mm,
that effect. But I still I think that there's still a bit of a um when people feel overly emotional, there's this sense of not necessarily always honoring those emotions, because philosophically, I think I've heard that emotions are kind of a reflection of your true being, like your true
Mm.
self, your soul, like from a philosophical standpoint. Like, so if you, it just from that point, it's like, are you're not fully honoring yourself, right, to some degree as well.
Yeah, yeah, that is true. Maybe it's more about how they're expressed, and I guess it is easier to think about it in terms of the emotions we might see more negatively, like anger and frustration. And I guess the difference might be that expressing it through saying "I am angry," even if it's yelling, is probably better than throwing things or hitting people and punching
Yeah.
stuff. But it's, yeah, it does still need to be honored. I think it's part of the human experience. It's what makes us who we are, and our
And
lives
to
what they are.
and to some degree, like, I mean, kids are, not to some degree, I think this is fairly true. I would, is kids are some of the most, are the most present beings, right? Like,
Yes.
they're so mindful, they're so in their moment, and it's usually us as parents who are pulling them along to, practice or whatever the next appointment is, and
Mhm.
taking them away from just being and feeling those emotions. And
Yeah.
then we kind of wonder when they're adults and they're struggling to find themselves, right?
Yeah.
Because we kind of strip that away to some degree, right? So there's like this kind of careful balance, it feels like, of when to allow them to kind of embrace emotions, but you kind of also need them to understand that, maybe that feeling of, and like, I think these negative emotions are easier to kind of talk about perhaps, but like that feeling of anger, you want to embrace that, but that over anger can also have consequences too, or may
Mm.
not be productive, in helping them understand that. But I think there's this, I don't know, maybe there's a fine balance. I could be wrong, but
No, I mean, you are reflecting to what we, I guess, professionals, so in terms of child psychology, or whether it's education as well, seem to observe that we are trying to put more things on kids than they're perhaps at the developmental level for. And so, if kids didn't need to be sitting in school for the rest of the day, they wouldn't have such pressure to regulate their emotions to this degree. They would be able to, just follow the happiness, and if they were angry, just deal with it, and it wouldn't be such a problem. It's just because they were expecting them to be in school, and
hmm,
that kind of thing. So it definitely, there are definitely elements, I think, of what would be great for kids in their development that just doesn't quite fit with our modern day life, and maybe
right,
that's where some of the struggle comes from.
yeah, and the societal construct that we have, right?
Mm.
Yeah, yeah, interesting. Thank you, for appreciate having that conversation. But the
It's
other
really
thing that's on my
interesting.
mind, yeah, no, the other thing that's on my mind is, this might not be directly connected to uh, neurodivergent kids, but just there's a lot of things happening in this world right now, like
Hmm.
whether it be globally. I think there's in many places an affordability crisis that's happening.
Yeah. Yep.
There are bigger challenges like the climate crisis and global warming. There are conflicts all over the world. There's so much information that's being given to kids, whether it be inadvertently or whether it just happens they're seeking it or whatever. How, like, I feel like kids are probably having a hard time with managing all the kinds of things that are being, uh, that this globe is being exposed to and people are being exposed to. How do we support kids? Because in one way, like, I know for my daughter, I want her to understand that there are things that are happening in the world. There are challenges. I don't want her to not know these things. And so naturally, sometimes she has these questions, and she'll just be like, "Daddy, I've had enough. Like, I'm good." And I'm so
Hmm.
appreciative of when she tells me that, because I'm somebody who sometimes, and this is maybe a fault of mine, I can, in terms of just wanting to give her that information and educate her and make sure she has it correct, I might go a bit overboard, and she's always
Right.
good with, like, being like, I'm good," which is helpful. But yeah, just supporting kids with the kind of things that they're inundated with. How do we best do that as parents?
I think, yeah, it is hard, isn't it? Because there's all of those things that you mentioned. I know climate change is a big one, especially here in Australia. Kids are really a bit, you know, what's the word, ambivalent about things like their
Mm,
futures and stuff because
yeah,
they're worried about what it's going to be like. But also technology as well. I think
yeah,
technology is evolving way faster than our brains have. And so kids are constantly bombarded with lots of that information and messages through things like, using mobile phones and the internet at school and
mm-hmm,
all that kind of
mm-hmm,
stuff. So it is really challenging. I take the approach that you take about trying to answer the questions that kids have. Um, I use the analogy to if you're talking to kids about sex education or something like
mm-hmm.
that, they'll ask questions, and so I recommend that parents answer the question and then wait and see if their kids ask more, because that to me is a good guide for how much information they're looking for. If the answer you give them is fine and like your daughter's like, okay, thanks, yep, got it,
Yeah.
then they've got the answer that they need or are looking for. Whereas if they keep asking questions, just keep answering the questions because they obviously want to know more. And I think then if the conversation ends and kids might come back next day or a couple of days later or even months later and ask
Mm-hmm.
another question, a follow-up question. Um, so my guide is to be honest and provide the information and how you see it. And a part of honesty too is that it's okay to admit when you don't know, and you
Mm-hmm.
might not know the answers. You could find them out together, or you could say, I've said to my kids on a couple of occasions, you know what, I'm not 100% sure. I'll get back to you on that,
Yeah,
and go do a quick Google, like how to explain this to your child or something.
yeah,
And
yeah.
um,
As long as you know 30% of the time, right?
yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
Well,
yeah.
not really, because if you're saying, I hear you, that's important to you. Me too. I don't know yet, but I'll go
Mm.
find out. Then you've met their need because you
Ah,
have
okay.
actually responded to them. You don't
Yeah,
have to know all the answers. It's just about taking them seriously.
yeah.
Yeah.
Do you often have to? I mean, you talked about, like, for example, sex education. I just wonder, like, what also dawned to me is, do you have a lot of clients with coming from different cultural backgrounds, and how do you kind of slice through that? I guess, right? Like, because there are cultural norms that also come into play with parenting for sure.
Mm,
So how do you kind of weave your way through to be able to give the kind of advice and counseling that you maybe know not to be right, or whatever it is?
yeah. I I think I usually talk to families about what's typical for them.
Mm-hmm.
And that gives me an idea of what they're expecting given, or yeah, I guess I do it in terms of culture as well. So most families are different. That's the funny thing I think about families, is that they're like, each family is like a different planet, really. And then
Mm-hmm.
you put two together, you get married, and then you're trying to raise a child when you're both from different planets. It's so complicated. So there's always that about what do you expect, and what do you expect as you're co-parenting together. But then when you add on that as well, it's about talking about what's normal for your culture, or what do you expect. And um, I think any work I do with kids has got to be in the context of what their parents want for them,
Right.
and that's usually in line with their culture and their values and that
Yeah.
kind of thing.
So you're kind of almost meeting them where they're at to some degree.
Yeah, that's right. Because
Yeah.
there's no one right way to be a person or a
Mm-hmm.
kid. And so I guess yeah, I'm always trying to support parents with what their goals are for their kids, assuming
Mm-hmm.
as long as that's in the best interest for the child.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. As we kind of maybe get to the end here, one of my also other questions is, what are the top things that you're having to deal with? Like, what are the top concerns or issues that you typically hear from your clients?
That's a good question too. It's trying to filter or distill lots of things down into one question. I think it's a bit of both. Sometimes I have families who come to me, I guess, because of the context of their child's development and maybe it's not going as they expected. Parents just want to know, um, they often will say things like, I want to just understand my child and make sure that I'm giving them what they need. So it's almost just like they want to double check that they're on the right track. Um, yeah. And in terms of, what those needs are, I guess the biggest things for they want their kids to be happy, and enjoy their life. And
Hmm.
so usually that's about school and friends. So it might be being able to be in the classroom and feel good about the progress they're making academically, or it's with being able to make friends and keep friends and be resilient in that way.
Right. Right. Yeah.
Mm.
Yeah. That's great. Before we kind of go into the last two questions I ask every guest, anything you
Mm.
feel like you wanted to share or talk about in terms of your work that you feel like would be helpful for parents?
Um, I think probably just that most of the time it's going to be okay.
Mm.
A lot of what I do is reassure parents as well. And even if you've done something that's, um, maybe wasn't the best choice or whatever, and so maybe I'm thinking that in terms of sleeping, and now, your kid can't sleep on their own and it's a palaver at bedtime. You can always address it at some point. You can always decide, all right, now we've got to get a handle on this. Let's do it. So there's no real, there's always opportunity to get things back to how you would like them to be.
I hope so, because yeah, the bedtime example is live and well at our house right now.
Yeah.
So,
Well, it's
and
been in
I
my house as well, and we got it back. It's so common. Yeah.
yeah, yeah, and you just
Mm.
sometimes obviously that you're not alone, and so many parents and families are dealing with these things. But boy, do you ever feel like you're on your own island, and that no one, that you're the only one on this planet experiencing these things. But and we know that that's not the case. But,
Yeah, that's the thing. I'm sure every single parent has talked about every single one of their children at some point
mhm,
about not feeling on top of it. Yeah.
yeah,
We're all in it, the same boat.
yeah, for sure. It's awesome. Shall we move to the last two questions, or is there anything else you want to add?
Yeah, sure. No, I'm happy to go into these ones. I've been thinking about them.
Awesome. Okay. Well, our five for different dinner question, dead or alive, who are five people you'd want to have supper with?
This was really, it made me think about it. But the first one that came straight to mind was my sister. She lives
Okay.
in the US. So I miss her a lot. I would love to
Oh,
have her over for dinner
I
every
feel like that
week if
one's
I can.
probably possible, right? Like it's, uh,
Yeah, well, she's just applied for citizenship, and so she's not traveling for a while.
okay.
I visited her earlier this year, but
Yeah,
yeah, yeah, seeing her
that's
again would
great.
be awesome.
Yeah, great.
Mm. The
Who's number
next
two?
one's, well, I had Shonda Rhimes actually, who
Okay.
is responsible for writing awesome shows like Grey's Anatomy and others. I think
Yeah,
she's really a beautiful storyteller and so creative, and so I'd love to. I bet she's got some great stories to tell.
yeah, yeah.
And then I had two big ones, Taylor Swift and Michelle Obama, and I
You
think,
know what? Taylor Swift is creeping on to everyone's list
is
these
she?
days. Even people who I would not, on the surface would not expect them to name Taylor Swift. I was like, oh, there everyone's
Yeah,
becoming a Swiftie. So
I think she's going to be. a historical figure, right? She's got that feeling about her. But for me, it's
Yeah.
just someone was showing me a clip of her yesterday doing an interview talking about how the media's trying to it gives you messages about who you should be and what's cool and all of that kind of stuff, and how she's tried to not follow that and to do that and also become probably unprecedentedly successful in her field
Mm.
is really interesting. Um, yeah, and
Yeah,
I think
what a meteoric rise to, like, you think about the actual length of her career. It's not all that long, and
no,
yeah,
and I don't know if it's true or if it's a perception, but she seems to be doing it while being herself and her own personality. And I'm sure there's, elements of it that's every public figure has a public persona
sure.
and then their real self, I'm sure. But yeah, that's what for me is really interesting. I see her as an interesting role model for people that way.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, great one. And then you said Michelle Obama. I mean, I feel like
Yeah.
it's self-explanatory. But what is something you appreciate about her?
I think it's interesting. I felt bad to leave Barack Obama off the list, but I was like, hey, Michelle, I
I feel
listened
like you
to,
would probably publicly say that's probably understandable. So
yes, I think so
yeah,
too.
yeah, yeah.
I've listened to both of their biographies,
Mm,
which they both read, and Michelle's I just felt like had this real um, strength of character that really came
right.
through, and a lot of um, things I admired and looked up to as a mother as well. So I would love to have conversations with her about things like that.
She actually came to Edmonton, and my wife and I got to see her.
Oh
Not
wow.
not like, yeah, I didn't get to
Not
meet
shaking
her, but
hands, no.
yeah, not shaking hands, but from very far away in the bleachers, we got to see her. But yeah, she was great to hear, and there's a sense of authenticity for sure that shines really really bright. Both in her
Yeah.
book, I agree with you, and just in the way she speaks for sure.
Yeah,
Yeah,
definitely.
yeah.
And then my final person was one that probably people haven't heard of. Her name is Holly Ringland.
Okay,
Ringland.
okay.
She's an Australian author. The couple of themes here, I guess, Shonda and Michelle have both written books that I liked. I love Holly Ringland's books. She's a novelist who writes about places in Australia and families and people, but she describes the places that she writes about in such wonderful ways you can imagine it. And yeah, I've every book I've read of hers, I've been just fully immersed and captivated. So
Mm,
reading is my favorite hobby. You might be able to see
mm.
there's a few things behind me. So that's why I picked
I
her.
can tell by your five people too, right? It's
Yeah.
very evident. So yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yep.
That's
So I
great.
might try and make some of them happen.
Yeah, totally. You might be able to. Okay, last question. Besides the circle of life, what do you know for sure?
I think that what I know for sure is if we can quiet all of the turbulence and noise in our minds, I think that our instinct is there and tells us what to do. Yeah, that's
Yeah, if you can
what I
quiet the
think.
turbulence, yeah, and noise, you can. Our instincts tell us what's real. Yeah,
Yeah, that
that's
just popped into my
that's
head when I read the question. So I was like, I'm going to go with that.
that's something I feel like we all strive for, but are not always all successful with, right?
Yeah, yeah, it's incredibly difficult. There's so much turbulence and
Yeah,
yeah, lots of information coming at us, and not to mention our own thoughts we have at a mile a minute probably. So,
yeah, yeah.
yeah.
This was a lot of fun, Leanne. I'm really glad we got to meet each other. Thank you for making time for this show and myself to be able to share some of the things that I'm going through, my family's going through, and be able to just weave that into the conversation. I really appreciate that. And I know a lot of parents, or aspiring parents, kids will get a lot of this. Will get a lot of benefit from this episode. So appreciate you have you're always welcome anytime to come back onto the show, and yeah, really great to connect, being this far away. So I hope you enjoyed yourself as much as I did as well.
Yeah, thank you. I did. Yeah, I really appreciate it. And it's so interesting for me that I think about my goals is to share information with parents to make the journey a little bit easier. But I feel like I've gotten so much myself out of today in such a rich
Mm.
conversation. So yeah, I feel like I've gotten just as much as I've given, if not more. So thank you so much. It's been really enjoyable.
Oh, that's great. That's fantastic. Okay, well, we'll maybe keep in touch in the future. But yeah, thank you again so much, and thanks everyone for listening today. Like, subscribe, do all those wonderful things, and we'll see you on the next episode. Cheers.